Wasowich is a master gardener, and we were actually introduced through a fellow master gardener at the Little Red Hen Community Garden, and he presented to them last fall and was highly well received. So I invited him back to talk to the Clipper gardeners and invite some people from Little Red Hen who couldn't see him last time. So you guys are great for coming here, and Paul's going to talk to us about how to make our soil more healthy.
Yeah, so let's see, I gotta say I'm just thrilled to know that there are other people who really care about soil and think about soil. For myself, I know that as I'm growing, more and more my thoughts and my focus is on the soil itself. And I really am finding that the more healthy the soil is and the more happy the soil is, everything grows. I really don't need to worry that much about anything else. The action is really happening from the soil level down, and what's happening above the ground turns out to be a little less important. And so I'm going to talk about what I'm finding is really working for building and maintaining healthy soil. So let's see. And I've got a bunch of pictures to go along with it. So I'm gardening in San Mateo in a community garden. About half hour from here. There's my spot right over here. We're kind of on a hillside, so I get some wind, but it's not bad. Here is one angle of my space. This is about 14 feet across by 26 feet deep. Nice. So we're very lucky to have relatively big spaces. This community garden is interesting in that it was somewhat organic in how it came about. Apparently a mail carrier years ago noticed an abandoned corner of a rarely used park and said this would be a good place for a garden. And he kind of made it happen, and a few people joined him. And the funny part, it's funny to hear this today, but back then, and this was maybe mid-70s, they couldn't find enough people to tend the plots. So each person had like 4 or 5 plots like this, and it really wasn't until maybe 10 to 15 years ago that things started to catch on. And now we probably have 80 people on the wait list, which probably sounds familiar. The city of San Mateo in the 90s almost turned this into a parking lot in their great wisdom, but some activist residents were able to raise their voice and save the garden, and today we're really glad that they have. And so there's actually a second garden that's being planned in another park. Let's see. What I can tell you also, just since this is a nice picture of my garden, this is a funny failed experiment here. You can see these little wisps here of garlic that are just struggling to make it. And this is an edible chrysanthemum. We eat the leaves. It's like an Asian cuisine. And it is such an aggressive grower that it just consumed all of the water and nutrients, and the garlic really didn't go anywhere. And then I've got my fava growing here very nicely, and a little bit of kale. And you can see I was trying to mulch some onions down here.
When was the photo taken?
This would have been around now a year ago. Yeah, so around February. Let's see. Oh, and you can see my compost pile back here. So I'm kind of nuts when it comes to garden planning, as you can see. And so I took Excel and I made a map for myself of what I was going to put where. When I did the math at the end of the day, between my 2 crops for the year, my summer and my winter, I'd grown over 100 different varieties without really needing to. And so one of the key messages that I want to share with you here is that if I'm growing this intensively, I've got to really be careful with my soil, or I'm going to exhaust it. I'm going to wear it out, and then I'm going to be in trouble. So when it came to winter, I needed to rest my soil and rest myself. And so I really simplified. Much of the garden I did in cereal rye and vetch, and I'll show you pictures of both of those later in order to help the soil build. And then I did a little area of like beets and cabbage and whatnot. And then I have some perennials over here along the side in terms of strawberries and tree collards and whatnot. So I just want to point out that for me, I have this big contrast between summer, Although a lot of this is grains too. Here's my quinoa, my sorghum, my wheat up here. And so the mix of how much I do in grains versus how much I do in legumes versus everything else is really critical to getting the right balance. And I'll talk about that. And it's also nice too because I'm doing cereal, rye, and vetch here, I'm getting very few weeds this winter. So I have a beautiful cover on my soil. It captures a lot of the water that we're getting. It keeps the soil nice and kind of fluffy. And it's setting me up for a nice spring. After today, I will be sending out summaries. You might want to take notes along the way, but I'll be sending out slide summaries. Yes?
I was curious when you planted your cover crop.
That's a great question. I'll tell you, last year I was late, and it was a problem. This year it was kind of mid-Indian summer. I wanted to have about a month of heat left to get it established. And that worked out really well. Last year I didn't get it in until, so it was probably around October, early October I got it in. Last year I did it more like November and I was late and it didn't do well. Yeah, there's and it's going to also vary, that's in San Mateo, it's probably a little bit different here. But I would err on the side of being early until you can really nail that. So, really, these are the 4 parts of the game around understanding what's going on in the soil, the grains, the legumes, and then there's a special way of making compost that I'm doing that's working very well and is relatively little work. So it's kind of the best of both worlds that I like. And I don't hear about many people doing it, so I want to tell you about it. Okay. So we have this decision point to make when it comes to soil, and a lot of people aren't thinking about this, but we need to think of our soil as either alive or dead. So most of the commercial processes, and I'm not sure exactly what they're doing for organic, but most of the commercial processes look at soil as just a medium to grow in. They're really not getting any nutrient from the soil. They almost don't want to have biological processes going on in the soil. They just kind of need stuff to grow in. I've heard about tomatoes being grown basically in sand, and then they just pump it full of the nitrogen fertilizer, and then they get tomatoes that taste like cardboard. I think there's a better way, and so let's look at what's in the soil. So parts of this chart aren't so surprising, right? Like, okay, so soil is over half the minerals, right? It's got some water in it, 1/4 water. The air is a really critical one, and it's an easy one to forget. I've gotten in the habit myself of never walking directly on my soil. I'm always walking on a board or on stepping stones or something like that. The soil gets compacted quite a bit already from rain even, or wind. And so to the extent that I cannot walk on my soil, I end up retaining more air, which is really great for the organisms in the soil, which can now breathe better, and the worms that can move through and whatnot. So that air and the water is in support of the organic matter. And what I'm starting to understand more and more is that the organic matter is where the magic happens. For the people who are the hardcore soil scientists, that's really what they spend all their time looking at. And I have a little video that hopefully will run that we can see that organic matter in action. So when I say organic matter, so here we've got like the organisms, the roots, and then humus. So there are different types of organic matter. It's not all just one thing. And the key spectrum we're looking at is active versus passive. So the active stuff might be like fresh manure. Fresh manure, if it doesn't burn your plants, if it's not that concentrated, it can give a lot of nutrient very quickly, but it's kind of like eating all carbs or that kind of thing, where it's just not a healthy way to go. That if I know people who grow a lot of vegetables in a small area by putting a lot of, say, composted horse manure every year. And that soil, if you were to stop putting manure, is going to do very, very poorly. There's no long-term fertility built into that. What the soil scientists tell us is that it's this humus, it's this passive humus that lasts a long time, that has a different color, it has a richer color. That's the stuff that they say can last even hundreds of years. When they go into archaeological sites and they're looking at, what were people growing, sometimes they find some of the humus that's been around for a long, long time. And so this is the fertility that will keep giving to us over time. And it's really where our heads need to be at when we're making compost or where we're looking to feed our soil. And it's a critical distinction about short-term versus long-term. I wanted to put this diagram in because it very nicely shows the voids that are in the soil. If you've been in your garden and you've ever seen worms moving through the soil, I often wonder, how are they moving through this? Are they just incredibly strong? And I think it really comes down to the voids, the air spaces. And so this is part of why we really need to protect our soil in terms of being really smart about how we mulch it, how we water it, and how we keep it nice and fluffy. Those spaces also give the roots a lot more play in order to move around. So once I was at a mini farm in an area called Coyote Valley, and there was a young man and he was potting up seedlings. And I said, "Oh, what's in the potting mix? What kind of a mix are you using?" And he said, "I don't know, I think it's just soil." But it wasn't soil. And this is something that we need to go out and tell all of our friends and have everybody know what the difference is between soil and potting mix, because it is the difference between life and death, really. Where when you have soil, you have life, you have microorganisms, you have processes going on in that. Whereas if you have potting mix, it's really an inert, dead material that is just a really different ballgame. So let's see, I want to press these around, and let's say you can just sort of shake them around and have a look. One of the telltales for the potting mix is that it has perlite, these little white things in it. And it's really not an ideal place for these ecosystems of organisms to grow. Furthermore, it's fairly artificial. So part of the reason why potting mix exists is that if you're growing in pots, one of your big problems is compaction and the ability to hold water, because you have so little space that the balance can get thrown off in that. Whereas if you're growing, even in a small garden plot, you have a lot more space for things to balance out. So potting mix, I think it has its place. I haven't had to use it yet for anything, but I understand why people use it. But there's a problem too with potting mix in that it has a real environmental cost. So one of the most common types of potting mix has vermiculite, perlite, and peat moss in it. So, starting from the top, the vermiculite, when it's mined, it's often mined in proximity to asbestos, just the way that things layer out. And so if you ever get a bag of vermiculite, you'll notice there's a warning on it that says you need to have a dust mask or something, because you could be inhaling asbestos. So it's not really nice stuff. And a funny thing about perlite is what they do is they mine it and then they heat it to amazing temperatures. And it pops. And when it pops, it creates these channels that are really great for holding water. However, if we're really trying to be ecologically friendly, we have to keep in mind that the only way you can get temperatures like that is by burning oil or fossil fuels. And so it's the sort of thing that if we can avoid using it, we really ought to. And then the peat moss, there are various debates online about how harmful is peat moss. On the one hand, I do believe, so the peat moss industry will say, no, we can extract this stuff and then we can recondition the land. But what they're not telling you is you don't get a peat moss bog again on the other side. You get something else. So those peat moss areas really are going away, and you're getting, I don't know, like a grassland or something like that. I think part of the issue is that you have to drain the land in order to be able to extract the peat moss. So again, that's something that if we're going to use it at all, it needs to be used extremely sparingly, as opposed to like, okay, we're going to grow, let's get our peat moss out. In fact, I was actually just at Rainbow Market today, and they have this really green-looking potting mix thing, and it's 70% peat moss. And I think there are better alternatives. So let's see if this video comes up. All right. I'll just shut off the volume here. Okay. So we're seeing all of this is on a petri dish. We're seeing all kinds of little creatures, different sizes. Some of them larger, some of them smaller. And in any healthy soil, these are all swimming around, eating each other, interacting, and through those processes we can get a lot of natural fertility from our soil. And so anytime that I'm putting something into my soil, or considering putting something to get rid of slugs or whatever, I need to be thinking, what impact is that going to have on those little creatures? So, given that the soil is alive, now I need to think about what can I do to care for the soil. So one of the things that I do every year is I at least do a single dig, where I go in with a digging fork and I loosen the soil. There have been various debates around what they call no-till, like don't ever touch your soil at all. And that's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is going through with a rototiller, right, which basically blends the soil, and you get a very fine, almost like a dust on the other side. My take is that we really don't want to be on one end of the spectrum or the other, but maybe somewhere in the middle, maybe more towards the no-till. And so I go in and I'll gently fork the soil in order to add some air and give those roots a place to go. Some years I also do a double dig, where I take the first foot of a trench and I'll gently dig it out and put it in a bucket, and then I'll go into the second foot and then I'll loosen. So then I get loosening 2 feet down. The soil really does compact. I think if you've done your soil right, maybe, I don't know, 8 to 10 years down the road, maybe you don't need to do the double digging anymore, because your soil is fluffy enough and rich enough and structured enough that it won't get compacted too badly. But certainly if you're in a new space, the chances are that you've got pretty compacted soil. Also, I think 2 feet is a good number. You want to be able to have a good root zone 2 feet down in order to be able to grow a lot of stuff. And there's also a practicality aspect as well, that going deeper than 2 feet, it's a lot of work. We actually dug out a bed at Little Red Hen that used to be a walking path. And it was so hard and so filled with clay that I actually went in with a jackhammer and loosened it up. Even that was a lot of work, though.
Right, sure was. But of course, the plots in community gardens, you don't have 2 feet. That space isn't available. So how do you adjust for that?
Yeah, is it that you have clay underneath, or what do you got?
Well, it started out with clay, but most people have added soil packages and compost and from Flower Craft or whatever. So it's largely, I think, commercial soils mixed with some clay, actually, or clay-y soil that was donated by the city at the start. But the depth of the plots is, maybe 8 to 10 inches. What do you?
Because of the gopher wire?
Because of the gopher wire.
Yeah,
Exactly.
so you have gopher
Yeah,
wire.
yeah,
Got it.
right. Yeah.
Got it, yeah, the gophers. If it's not one thing, it's another, right?
Yeah, I mean, most everybody has had to rewire their plots
Got
because
it.
the first wire wasn't official gopher wire, and gophers were too smart for it. But yeah, but anyway, so that does
That's a
does
challenge.
limit, and
Yeah.
so for
Certainly if I was going in and I was redoing gopher wire, I would see if I can loosen deeper down, even if I'm not necessarily putting the wire any deeper. I'd want to loosen to the extent that I can. So I like to dig and have this fluffy soil, and as I'm digging, I'm standing on these digging boards. This is a much earlier version of my garden, but I had these boards that I was walking on in order to access things. One of the big things that you can do to build soil is to protect it in the first place, and there's really 3 ways that I think about doing this. One of them is that I plant on what's called an offset grid. And so I plant every plant, so for instance for beets it might be every plant is 6 inches from another plant. And I do it in an offset grid, so that rather than it being, how do I put it? I have a picture somewhere, but in any case, every plant is 6 feet from the other, so I end up with a canopy like this when I do my transplants. What that canopy does is it keeps the soil covered, it keeps it cool, it holds more moisture in, and it also protects the soil from erosion from wind.
Do you direct seed or do you use all transplants?
I grow my own transplants for the most part, yeah. I get really good survival rates. I probably have greater than 90% survival rate on my seedlings, probably more like 95. I transplant them when they're about 3 or 4 inches high. My weeding gets easier because in those in the early time before the canopy forms, it's really easy to tell what's a weed and what's not because there's such a size difference. So yeah, the transplants have been working really well for me. Yeah. Another thing too is I save a lot of water because I can grow. So for instance, for beets, I can probably grow, I don't know, 60 to 80 of them in maybe 60 in a space like this. Whereas if I'm watering 60 seeds in the garden, it's going to be a lot of bigger space. Also in the early germination phase, those seeds are going to be extremely water sensitive. So should I happen to have a dry day, I could lose a lot of seeds. Whereas if it's just in a flat, I could move the flat around, I can pay more attention to it. So I find it also saves me a lot of water. So let's see, I've actually brought some soil covers to show you. Let's see, so we'll pass this one around. So here's the more artificial side of this is what I originally started using, and there's the more natural side. And I'm getting more into the natural stuff. It's just, it's more expensive and whatnot. But I find that it does a very nice job of helping to keep my soil covered. Especially, you have that time when you're changing from A to B and B isn't quite ready yet, or you're kind of too tired to put it in. I find it's really good to keep that soil covered. Yeah.
How much more expensive is the burlap?
It's about twice, I think. I've been buying it at Joann Fabric. Especially they do some big coupons sometimes.
Sure they do.
So if you time it right, it's not so bad. But I haven't found any really good deals on burlap so far.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Let's see. The third thing that I do is there are some crops like garlic and onions that never form a canopy. And so I mulch them. This is mulched probably with a wheat straw. Some of that I grew, some of it I just got from Halloween cast-offs of bales of straw. Let's see, one tip if you're going to mulch your onions like this is to put the mulch down before you transplant because it's a pain to do it after the stalks have come out.
Does the straw not have seeds in it?
It tends not to. Yeah. Yeah, that hasn't been a problem. Okay, so here's the other thing I wanted to show you is I spent a lot of time finding this shade cloth. This is actually an industrial shade cloth. What kills you on ordering this stuff is the shipping. So it's the perfect kind of thing that if you can order some with a friend or a few friends, it works out really well. But this is a 30% shade cloth. And when I was transplanting, I can't remember what crop this was, but you can actually see the difference just from the shade cloth in how dry versus wet the soil is. And you can see that basically the shade cloth only shaded up until around here. But it's a dramatic difference. This is probably dry about half an inch deep. So simply from a 30% shade cloth, you can protect the soil quite a bit. And of course, watering as well. The covers that you put on the soil can really help with keeping the moisture in. I'm in, some people like to water really heavily, like once a week or something like that. I'm in the school of more trying to keep the soil fairly evenly moist. Of course, it's a lot easier in winter than summer. But I try to get out there maybe once a day, every other day in summer to try to keep things pretty moist. There is a condition that the soil can get that's called, where it gets hydrophobic, where you put water on it and the water just runs off. You don't want to get there. Once you get hydrophobic, it's going to be very hard to get the water to move evenly through the soil. Whereas if you can keep your soil nice and moist, it will move the moisture around, kind of like a sponge moves moisture around. But once your soil goes hydrophobic, you're in trouble. Like that soil sample that we're passing around. Well, the other one, the one with the real soil, yeah. If we were to put water on that, you would be amazed how much the water will run off of it. So I'm a believer in trying to keep it moist.
Paul? And what about using as much mulch as possible if that's available? For example, the city does give it away in its giveaways.
Is that like a bark mulch? Like a mulched eucalyptus or something like
I'm
that?
not
No, it's from the ecology mulch from the garbage supply.
But yeah, but what is it composed of?
It's mostly, it's not a lot of bark, it's more kitchen garbage, kitchen waste.
You know what scares me about that stuff is that if it has lawn clippings in it, I know a lot of people put really nasty chemicals into their lawn to avoid the weeds from coming up, and it's almost certainly in that stuff. So I avoid it because I don't know what's in it. Yeah, I think a best bet if you want a lot of mulch is around Halloween to scope out the castaway straw bales that, you know, Trader Joe's typically has some, and if your timing's right and you have a big tarp, because it does go everywhere, you can scoop up a bale or two and you'll have plenty.
Paul?
Yes.
So the composting process doesn't break down pesticides or herbicides,
I don't think so.
even if it's the hot kind? Okay,
It's my understanding.
all right.
It'll kill the sort of like the the stuff that might be in manure. That kind of thing might die. So the stuff that the health department would be most worried about, but the chemicals, I think a lot of them remain, if not all of them. So yeah, I wouldn't touch the city stuff for that reason. So it's very funny, as I walk around my community garden, I would say 2/3 of the plots look something like this, where people say, well, it's winter and I don't really want to do anything, so I'll just leave the soil bare. And it's a huge mistake, especially when we could plant a cover crop like vetch or cereal rye fairly easily and have it just grow. You can even, at a lot of the garden centers, they'll have a winter cover crop mix, and you just sort of get the soil good and wet and scatter it in and water it for a few weeks and forget about it. And it'll really go a long way to protect your soil. So I planted cereal rye here, and you see how nice and rich it got. I show up about every week and a half and put water just because I feel like I should. But when I go and feel the soil, it still feels moist. So even though we've had relatively little rain since the big storm, it's been fine. It's been maintenance free.
What variety of vetch do you like to use?
You know, I used to buy mine at Common Ground in Palo Alto, but of course now they're out of business. So the short answer is going to be whatever I can source on eBay that's organic and cheap. And that's one tip I don't mention in here. You can get some seeds by the pound on eBay for shockingly little money, $10 to $12 a pound, which if you compare to like $3 or $4 for a little seed packet, it's just another universe. So. especially, you know, if you split it with a few friends, it's pretty good.